It began as a quiet June night in Surfside, Florida. The moon reflected off the Atlantic, waves lapped against the shore, and most of the residents inside Champlain Towers South were asleep. But at 1:22 a.m., the ground gave way. In 12 horrifying seconds, a 12-story condominium, home to 98 people, crumbled into dust. It was one of the deadliest structural failures in modern U.S. history. Rescue teams worked for weeks, pulling debris by hand, praying for survivors. The images haunted the nation, a symbol of how fragile life could be when cracks are ignored and warnings dismissed. Investigators found years of deferred maintenance, corroded rebar, and ignored inspection reports. But for Florida, this was not just a tragedy. It was a wake-up call. Because beneath the surface, hundreds of other buildings across the state were quietly showing the same signs: aging concrete, poor drainage, neglected repairs. The question wasn't if another collapse would happen, it was when. In the months that followed, lawmakers scrambled to act. Engineers inspected coastal towers. Condo boards panicked. Homeowners watched their property values swing wildly. And amid the chaos, one truth became clear: the Surfside collapse had changed everything. 3 years later, that night's echoes still haunt Florida. But now, the threat isn't falling concrete, it's financial ruin. Across Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties, thousands of families are watching their American dream crumble, one special assessment at a time. This is the story of how a state built on sunshine, retirement, and seaside comfort found itself drowning in debt, lawsuits, and despair. A story of how good intentions, safety, reform, prevention, turned into a crisis that no one saw coming. Because in trying to save lives, Florida may have broken its housing market. When the Champlain Towers South collapsed, it wasn't just the concrete that failed, it was trust. Residents had complained for years about cracks in the garage, water pooling beneath the pool deck, rusting columns. In 2018, an engineer warned of major structural damage. The condo board debated repairs but struggled to afford the $15 million bill. By 2021, it was too late. As survivors mourned, engineers began surveying other coastal high-rises built before the 1980s. What they found was chilling: hundreds of aging towers, many with similar structural vulnerabilities. The state faced a moral dilemma: how to ensure safety without forcing thousands of people from their homes. Governor Ron DeSantis called the collapse a horrific tragedy that must never happen again. He promised change, and change came fast, but few realized just how disruptive it would be. Because while Surfside forced lawmakers to confront safety, it also exposed the ugly truth about decades of underfunded associations. Boards had been keeping fees artificially low, avoiding reserves, deferring major repairs. The system itself was broken, and now, the fix would cost billions. The collapse marked the end of Florida's laissez-faire era in condo living. Overnight, inspection and reserve funding became the state's new buzzwords. But for the millions of retirees who had built lives in these buildings, the coming reforms would unleash a financial storm unlike anything Florida had ever seen. And as those laws rolled out, the shockwaves would reach every corner of the Sunshine State, from the wealthy shores of Miami Beach to the quiet retirement complexes of Fort Myers. Because when the dust settled, Florida's next collapse wasn't about structure. It was economic. In 2022, Florida passed Senate Bill 4D, a sweeping set of reforms designed to prevent another Surfside. At its core was a new rule: every condo taller than 3 stories had to undergo a milestone inspection once it reached 30 years of age, or 25 if near the coast, and every 10 years thereafter. Associations were also required to fully fund their reserves for critical repairs. No more deferrals, no more shortcuts. The law set a hard deadline: December 31st, 2024. Any building that failed to comply could face condemnation or insurance cancellation. On paper, it was a triumph for safety. But in reality, it was a ticking time bomb for affordability. For decades, many associations had kept monthly dues low by skipping reserve contributions. Owners preferred paying less now and dealing with it later. But later had finally arrived, and the numbers were staggering. Engineers uncovered millions in deferred maintenance. Buildings that once seemed fine were suddenly facing repair bills that rivaled their total property values. Local officials warned that compliance could bankrupt associations. Realtors feared a mass exodus of owners. And as inspection letters went out, one phrase began spreading like wildfire through Florida's condo communities: special assessment. These weren't minor charges. Some residents received bills exceeding $100,000, due immediately. Retirees on fixed incomes wept as they realized they couldn't stay. Families who'd lived in the same units for decades were forced to sell. The reforms had achieved their goal. Safety was finally being prioritized. But the cost of prevention was shattering lives. And just as Florida condo owners began to grasp how deep the financial hole ran, another shock hit them from an unexpected direction: insurance. Across Florida, mailboxes began filling with dreaded envelopes, special assessment notices. Inside, the numbers didn't seem real: $50,000, $120,000, even $300,000. For many, that was more than their annual income. Retirees like James Houghton, a 74-year-old Vietnam veteran, had paid off his unit decades ago. He called it his forever home. But when his association announced a $180,000 assessment to fund concrete restoration and roof repairs, James said, "I don't have that kind of money. I'd have to sell." And he wasn't alone. Thousands of owners faced impossible choices: drain savings, take out reverse mortgages, or walk away. Property values plummeted. Lenders grew wary. Units that once sold in weeks now sat for months with no offers. In many communities, the emotional toll was devastating. Neighbors turned against one another in heated board meetings. Some owners accused their associations of mismanagement. Others blamed the state for overreach. The phrase financial eviction began appearing in local news reports. The average Floridian condo owner, who had once paid $600 a month in maintenance, now faced total costs triple that amount. Many couldn't even refinance because of new lending restrictions tied to inspection compliance. This was the hidden bill for decades of neglect, and it was coming due all at once. The very reforms meant to protect lives had unleashed a financial shockwave that no one was prepared for. And as the letters kept coming, another system started buckling under the pressure: Florida's fragile insurance market. If special assessments were the first punch, insurance was the knockout. In 2023, Florida's insurance market entered freefall. Major insurers like Farmers and AAA either withdrew from the state or canceled policies outright. The reasons were complex: hurricane losses, reinsurance costs, and rising risk. But for condo owners, the result was simple: sky-high premiums and, in many cases, no coverage at all. Buildings that had paid $150,000 annually for coverage were suddenly quoted $600,000 or more. Some were told they didn't qualify for renewal until millions in structural work were completed, work they couldn't afford without the insurance in place. It was a deadly catch. 22. No insurance meant no financing, no sales, and no protection. Local officials sounded the alarm. "We're on the brink of an insurance collapse," one Broward County mayor warned. Without affordable coverage, condo associations risk default. And when a building can't insure itself, its value effectively drops to zero. Homeowners began fleeing inland, selling for pennies on the dollar. But even there, the crisis followed. Premiums for single-family homes doubled statewide. Florida's state-run insurer, Citizens, ballooned to over 1.3 million policies, a record high, and experts warned it couldn't handle a major hurricane season. Meanwhile, for those still in condos, the burden was unbearable. Maintenance fees soared as associations scrambled to cover insurance hikes. In some cases, monthly costs jumped from $800 to over $2,500. The dream of affordable seaside living had vanished. And the insurance meltdown didn't just threaten individual owners, it was shaking the foundation of Florida's entire real estate economy. Because when no one can insure, no one can buy. And when no one can buy, everything stops. By 2024, the Florida condo market had entered what economists called a frozen state. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two largest mortgage backers in the U.S., had quietly updated their lending standards. They now required full inspection compliance, reserve funding, and proof of safety for any condo loans. That meant thousands of Florida buildings were suddenly ineligible for federally backed mortgages. The effect was immediate and brutal. Buyers disappeared. Mortgage approvals plummeted. Real estate agents across Miami and Fort Lauderdale watched as deals fell apart overnight. A unit listed for $400,000 could no longer sell for even half that, simply because it was in a non-compliant building. Cash investors swooped in, hoping to buy low and flip later. But ordinary families, retirees, and working-class residents, the people who made Florida's coastal communities vibrant, were locked out. Listings piled up. Entire towers became ghost buildings. Realtors called it the condo apocalypse. Developers, meanwhile, saw opportunity. Some began offering to buy out entire associations to demolish and rebuild luxury towers, marketing them to wealthy out-of-state buyers. It was gentrification disguised as renewal. In Broward County alone, sales volume dropped by nearly 60%. In Miami-Dade, condos built before 1990 became almost unsellable unless they had completed their milestone inspections. Florida's housing market, once the envy of the nation, had been brought to its knees. And what began as a tragedy in Surfside had now spiraled into a statewide reckoning. Because this wasn't just a collapse of concrete. It was the collapse of an entire way of life. Behind every statistic and every dollar sign, there are real people, many of them elderly, on fixed incomes, and utterly blindsided by a crisis they never saw coming. In Hollywood, Florida, 81-year-old Nancy McGill sat at her kitchen table staring at a notice demanding $112,000 for concrete restoration. She'd lived in her unit for 36 years, raised her children there, and paid every bill on time. "They're telling me I have to pay this or move out," she said. "But where am I supposed to go?" Stories like Nancy's began flooding local news. Seniors skipping medication to pay maintenance fees. Veterans living out of their cars after being forced to sell. Communities that once felt tight-knit were unraveling under financial strain. Neighbors who'd spent decades together now found themselves in court battles over unpaid assessments. Some described the crisis as Surfside 2.0, not because of collapsing buildings, but collapsing lives. Mental health counselors in Miami-Dade reported a surge in stress-related illnesses among condo owners. For many, these homes were their life savings, their one safety net for retirement. Watching it disappear overnight felt like losing everything twice, first financially, then emotionally. The ripple effects were brutal. Families moved in together to survive. Adult children tried to help their parents cover bills, only to face debt themselves. Others simply packed up and left the state entirely, joining the quiet migration north, to Georgia, the Carolinas, even Tennessee, in search of affordable housing and peace of mind. Yet through it all, one haunting question lingered. Could all of this have been avoided? Because while safety reforms were necessary, the human cost revealed a deeper failure, one of planning, communication, and compassion. And as Florida's leaders debated new amendments and deadlines, another battle was already brewing, this time in the courtroom. By 2025, the condo crisis had become political and litigious. Across the state, lawyers were flooded with calls from homeowners who felt cornered by their associations, insurance companies, or even the state itself. Lawsuits piled up, alleging mismanagement, negligence, and unfair assessments. Some associations turned around and sued developers, accusing them of poor construction decades earlier. Others went after engineers and inspectors, claiming they failed to identify critical defects. The legal chaos became so intense that Florida's court system designated special dockets just to handle condo-related cases. Meanwhile, in Tallahassee, lobbying groups for builders, insurers, and realtors were fighting behind the scenes to reshape the rules. Developers pushed for looser inspection standards to revive construction. Insurance companies demanded rate hikes to stay solvent. Realtors begged for more time to meet the state's inspection deadlines, warning that the real estate market couldn't handle another hit. Governor DeSantis and state lawmakers faced mounting pressure. Critics accused them of rushing reforms without considering the economic fallout. Supporters countered that lives were at stake, that Surfside had proven the cost of inaction. In legislative hearings, angry condo owners packed the chambers, holding up photos of their homes and demanding relief. "We're being punished for something we didn't cause," one woman shouted through tears. Amid the noise, a few proposals gained traction, including low-interest state-backed loans and extended inspection deadlines for financially distressed associations. But even those were slow to materialize. The system was breaking down from every angle, financially, emotionally, and politically. And as lawsuits dragged on, one thing became clear: no one was walking away from this unscathed. Not the state, not the banks, not the insurers, and certainly not the residents. But just when it seemed like the worst was over, a new front in the crisis opened up, one that would determine Florida's future for decades to come. While thousands of condo owners were being priced out, developers saw opportunity. Private equity firms, investment groups, and foreign buyers began circling like hawks. They identified older, non-compliant buildings, the ones facing massive repair bills, and made buyout offers to desperate associations. The pitch was simple: sell now, take the payout, and walk away before the building goes under. For many, it felt like salvation. But for others, it was exploitation. Developers would tear down the old towers and replace them with gleaming luxury high-rises, condos priced far beyond the reach of average Floridians. Miami's skyline glittered brighter than ever, but the people who had built those communities were being pushed out. In Surfside itself, just a few blocks from the collapse site, construction cranes filled the sky. Units started at $3 million. Buyers came from New York, Dubai, and Sao Paulo, not from Florida. Local leaders called it disaster gentrification, the process of turning tragedy into profit. Real estate analysts warned that the trend would reshape Florida's coastline entirely. Affordable condos would vanish, replaced by high-end towers built for the global elite. The communities that once defined places like Hallandale, Sunny Isles, and Pompano Beach, retirees, teachers, middle-class families, were being erased. It was, as one economist put it, the quietest mass displacement in modern Florida history. And while developers and investors celebrated their gains, many former condo owners were left wondering whether safety had been the goal all along, or whether it had simply become the perfect excuse to clear the coast for profit. Because in the end, the Surfside tragedy didn't just expose structural cracks in concrete. It revealed the fractures in Florida's soul. As 2025 draws to a close, Florida stands at a crossroads. The state's condo safety reforms have made buildings stronger, but its communities weaker. Tens of thousands of Floridians have been priced out of their homes. Insurance remains volatile, and the dream of affordable coastal living feels further away than ever. Lawmakers are now weighing the next phase: relief programs, tax credits, or even federal assistance. The pressure is immense. Some call for stricter enforcement, others argue for compassion and delay. But everyone agrees: the status quo is unsustainable. Experts predict that over the next decade, Florida's housing map will be rewritten. Wealth will concentrate along the coasts, while middle-class residents retreat inland. Cities like Orlando and Ocala are already seeing population spikes from displaced coastal families. And though Surfside will forever symbolize the start of this crisis, its legacy now stretches far beyond Miami-Dade. It's a warning to every state with aging infrastructure and ignored maintenance, from California to New York. Because when cracks go unnoticed long enough, they don't just break buildings. They break lives. 3 years after the night Surfside fell, Florida is safer, but sadder. The state's skyline gleams with new construction, its laws stricter than ever. Yet beneath the surface lies a quiet grief for the families who lost loved ones, and for those who lost the homes they built their lives around. The tragedy that was supposed to unite and protect Floridians instead divided them by class, income, and geography. Safety came at a price, one so high that thousands couldn't afford to pay it. But maybe that's the hardest truth of all. Sometimes doing the right thing still hurts. Because when the state finally acted to stop buildings from falling, it never imagined how many people would fall through the cracks.